An old couple, soaked from a heavy storm, begged a Union veteran for one dry corner of his barn. He said no, not because he wanted to turn them away, but because something in his dog's eyes told him the real storm hadn't even started yet, and it wasn't made of rain. Rain swept sideways over the lead mining hills west of Mineral Point, Wisconsin, turning the old Military Ridge Road to soup. It was October of 1874, 9 autumns since Appomattox, and along that muddy stretch, one farmhouse window still burned like it hadn't gotten the news that the world was cruel. Inside lived Emmett Halvorsen, a Union Army veteran who trusted cattle more than company, and a big brindle farm dog named Sarge, who trusted almost nobody and forgave even less. Before we go further, drop where you're watching from in the comments. We love hearing from you. Because the moment Sarge rose off that porch and stared into the storm, Emmett Halvorsen's quiet, uncomplicated life was about to get a whole lot louder. As rain continued to hammer the tin roof, like a debt collector who didn't believe in Sundays, Emmett Halvorsen stood on the porch, a mug of coffee gone cold 20 minutes back, watching the lane the way a man watches a door he isn't sure he wants opened. He was 34, broad-shouldered, weathered hands, a jaw that rarely apologized for anything, and a limp he only mentioned when the weather turned mean. His father had raised sheep on this ridge. Emmett raised dairy cows, winter wheat, and mostly his own solitude. Beside the steps lay Sarge, a broad-chested farm dog, with one ear that never stood upright and a stare that had once made a traveling peddler apologize for existing. Sarge didn't bark at foxes, thunder, or the noon bell from town. So when he rose without a sound and pointed his whole body down the muddy lane, Emmett paid attention, the way a man pays attention to a rifle bolt sliding home in the next room. "What is it, boy?" Sarge didn't answer. Through the gray rain, two shapes came walking, slow and bent, leaning into each other like a fence line held up by stubbornness. Not lost, Emmett thought. Lost men moved faster. They stopped at his gate. The old man's coat had gone past, soaked into some sadder category of wet. "Evening," he called, voice shaking more from cold than fear, or so Emmett hoped. "We don't mean trouble. Could we shelter in your barn a spell, just till the rain lets up?" Emmett looked at the barn, then at the old woman beside him, trying hard not to shake, and losing the argument. "You're not sleeping in a barn," Emmett said. The old man's face folded into practiced apology before Emmett cut it off. "You're sleeping in a bed. I've got a spare room nobody's used since my mother passed." If a stranger's kindness on a wild, rain-soaked night still means something to you, hit subscribe now, because these two didn't wander onto Emmett's land by accident, and the storm outside is about to turn out to be the smaller one. Inside, the farmhouse smelled of wood smoke, coffee grounds, and pine tar, the honest smells of a man who lived alone and didn't apologize for it. Emmett stoked the stove, found 2 wool blankets that still smelled faintly of cedar, and set a kettle to boil while his guests dripped politely onto the floorboards, as if afraid to claim more space than that. "Name's Barnaby Attwater," the old man said, easing into a chair like his knees had opinions about the decision. "This is my wife, Millicent." He said it the way some men say a prayer, carefully, like the words still mattered after 50 years of using them. Millicent Attwater was small and silver-haired. Wrapped in a shawl, the rain had turned the color of wet slate. She held her tea without drinking it, the way people hold things when their hands need an excuse to stay busy. When she reached up to tuck a loose pin into her hair, her sleeve slid back, and Emmett saw it, a bruise circling her wrist, going yellow at the edges the way old bruises do. Millicent caught him looking and tugged the sleeve down fast. "Clumsy old bones," she said, too quickly, too lightly. I fell against the wagon step. Emmett had spent 4 years learning what people sounded like when they lied to stay alive. He said nothing. He'd learned that much too. Barnaby wrapped both hands around his mug, like it was the only warm thing left in the world. "We'll be gone by morning," he said. "Won't bring our troubles to your door." "Troubles generally find doors on their own," Emmett said, leaning against the counter, arms crossed. Millicent looked up, and for one unguarded second, real fear crossed her face. So plainly the room seemed to lose 10 degrees. Sarge, dozing by the stove, lifted his head. Outside, faint under the drumming rain, came the unmistakable clatter of a wagon moving too fast for the mud, and a man's voice, young, furious, close enough to carry over the storm, bellowing two names into the dark like accusations. "Barnaby, Millicent, I know you're in there." The wagon skidded to a stop outside the gate, one wheel throwing a wet arc of mud against the fence post. Barnaby's mug rattled in his hands. Millicent pressed both palms to her mouth, like she could hold the fear inside her chest by force. Emmett didn't hurry. Men who'd survived real trouble learned that panic was a gift you handed your enemy for free. He set his coffee down, crossed to the window, and lifted the curtain enough to see a heavy-set man climbing down from the wagon box, coat collar up, temper already boiling over. "Who's that?" Emmett asked, though the answer had been sitting in Millicent's fear the whole evening. "Roderick," Barnaby said, the name landing like something spat out rather than spoken. "Our grandson." Emmett opened the door before Roderick reached the gate. Sarge came with him, close to his left leg, not barking, not lunging, just present, the way weather is present. Roderick Crabtree was 44, thick through the middle from whiskey and easy living, sandy hair plastered flat, a nose bent slightly crooked from some old argument he'd never mentioned losing. "You the owner?" he barked. "This is my farm," Emmett said. "Your grandparents are inside it. They're confused. Wander off. I handle their accounts, their land papers, all of it. They can't manage themselves anymore." The words came fast and practiced, like a fence mended so many times nobody noticed the crooked boards anymore. "You locked me in the upstairs room," Barnaby said from the doorway, voice thin but steady. "For your safety," Roderick snapped. "You sold my mule. It was old. You took her wedding ring to pay a mining debt." For 1 second, Roderick's mask slipped, and something ugly showed underneath it. Then Sarge stepped forward. One slow, deliberate pace, a low growl rolling out of him, like distant thunder, deciding whether to become a storm. Roderick froze. "You threatening me with a dog?" "No," Emmett said evenly. "He's warning you himself. Keep them tonight. But tomorrow I'm back with the sheriff, and papers that say this farm and everything on it belongs to me." He spat into the mud and stalked back to his wagon. After the wagon's lantern shrank to nothing down the dark lane, Millicent broke quietly at the kitchen table. Not loud crying, just the kind that comes from years of practicing how not to be heard. Sarge rested his heavy head against her knee, like he'd been assigned the job by someone with more authority than Emmett. "Tell me all of it," Emmett said, pulling a chair across from Barnaby. It took the better part of an hour. Roderick had moved in 18 months back, after his own claim near Dodgeville went bust. First the mail, then the bank passbook, then the deed box, for safekeeping, he'd said. He sold the milk cow, the plow horse, half the tools in the shed, always with some reasonable excuse. Old, rusting, safer with him. When Millicent hid egg money in a flour tin, he found it and squeezed her wrist until she dropped to her knees. When Barnaby tried walking to town for the sheriff, Roderick told the neighbors his grandfather's mind was going, and folks, not wanting to embarrass a confused old man, stopped asking. "A man thinks age takes his strength first," Barnaby said quietly, staring into the stove fire. "It doesn't. Shame does." Emmett said nothing. He'd met plenty of men who wore uniforms and called cruelty duty. Turned out some just wore family instead. Near midnight, Sarge rose without being asked and walked to the mudroom, where Barnaby's damp coat hung dripping on a peg. He sniffed at the pocket, then nudged it hard enough that the coat swung on its hook. "What is it, boy?" Barnaby asked, confused. Emmett reached in and pulled out a small rusted tin box, wrapped in a handkerchief gone soft with age. Barnaby's face changed entirely. "I forgot I had that," he whispered. "Millicent told me to keep it close." always. Inside were folded property papers, an old land deed, a bank letter, and a note in shaking blue ink. If anything happens to us, ask Prudence Ackerman at the land office. She'll know what the papers really say. Morning came pale and reluctant over the Lead Hills, the kind of gray Wisconsin light that couldn't decide whether to rain again or simply sulk about it. Emmett hitched the wagon and drove Barnaby and Millicent the 3 miles into Mineral Point, past the limestone cottages along Shake Rag Street, where the old Cornish miners' widows still hung wash between diggings nobody worked anymore. Dr. Josephine Tillman ran her practice out of 2 rooms above the general store, and she examined Millicent first, gently, without the pitying softness that made people flinch. "Some bruises lie," she said, turning Millicent's wrist toward the window light, "and some tell you exactly where to look next." She found marks in several stages of healing, a wrenched shoulder, and a heartbeat that worried her more than she said aloud. Barnaby had a swollen ankle, an untreated cut, and the bone-deep exhaustion of a man who'd been afraid for longer than he'd admit. "I'll write it all down," Dr. Tillman said. "Not opinions, findings, dates." Barnaby looked at Emmett, who nodded once, and Barnaby nodded too, like permission was something he'd forgotten he was still owed. From there, Emmett drove them to the land office, a narrow limestone building that smelled of ink and old paper, where Prudence Ackerman kept the county's deeds in a memory sharper than most men's eyesight. She was somewhere past 50, gray-streaked hair pinned with the efficiency of a woman who had no patience for foolishness and less for cruelty, and she spread Barnaby's documents across her desk without a word of small talk. "This signature," she said, tapping the power of attorney, "doesn't match the one on your original deed. Different pressure, different hand." She held 2 letters side by side, and this was notarized the same week the county register shows Mrs. Attwater was laid up sick in this very town. "She couldn't have signed anything at your farmhouse that day." Millicent's hand tightened on her blanket. "I was here, sick as a dog." "Then he forged it," Prudence said simply. "And that, Mr. Attwater, is a crime even in Wisconsin." By early afternoon, Sheriff Corwin Ackley rode out to the old Attwater homestead with Deputy Otis Bramwell, mostly on Prudence Ackerman's word, which around Mineral Point carried more weight than most judges. The house sat 2 miles past town, once proud, gray at the edges, one window boarded from the inside like the house itself had given up arguing. Millicent waited in the wagon with Sarge while Barnaby insisted on going in, Emmett close enough to catch him if his legs failed, and far enough to let him keep what pride remained. Inside smelled of cold ash and neglect. A locked cash box sat on the counter beside a stack of unpaid bills. In the pantry, Emmett found Millicent's medicine bottles inside a padlocked bin. "She asked for those," Barnaby said hoarsely. "He told her she took too many." Upstairs, Sarge stopped at a door with a metal slide bolt on the outside, the kind meant for keeping something in. Sheriff Ackley swore under his breath and drew it back. The room beyond held 2 narrow beds, a nailed-shut window, and long pale drag marks scored into the floorboards, the kind a cane leaves when someone tries repeatedly to reach a door that won't open. Barnaby reached for the wall. He said it was so we wouldn't wander at night. In a desk drawer downstairs, they found the rest. A folder marked "Sale Pending," a survey map of the Attwater land circled in red pencil, and a letter from the Galena Ridge Mining Company offering to buy the property outright, provided the deal closed within 10 days. 10 days, and the last honest piece of the Attwater name would belong to a mining syndicate that had never once set foot on it. Sheriff Ackley took off his hat. "Well, Barnaby, looks like we've got about 9 days left to stop this properly. If you want to see whether 9 days is enough to save an old couple's home from a grandson who's already sold their trust once, subscribe now, because tonight, Roderick Crabtree isn't planning to wait for the paperwork." That evening, back at Emmett's farm, the rain had finally quit, leaving the sky the color of an old bruise itself. Emmett walked the fence line before supper, more out of habit than worry, Sarge trotting the perimeter with the seriousness of a soldier who took his post personally. He found it on the barn door, words dragged out in wet pine tar, crude and dripping. "Give us the old fools or watch it burn." Emmett stood there a long moment. Men didn't write threats like that because they enjoyed poetry. They wrote them because fear had worked on somebody before, and they'd never learned another trade. He didn't tell Millicent, he told Barnaby, quietly, and sent the neighbor boy, young Thaddeus Renner, riding for town with a note for Sheriff Ackley. Telephones hadn't found this ridge yet, and a fast horse was still the only wire worth trusting. Emmett moved the cows to the near paddock, doused the outer barn lantern to make the place look less watched than it was, and set a shotgun he rarely used within reach of the back door, more for peace of mind than intention. He placed a second lantern, unlit, in the hayloft window. A signal, if it came to that. "You think he'll come tonight?" Barnaby asked, watching from the porch, cane across his knees like an old sword that had forgotten it was ever sharp. "I think he wants you scared before sunrise," Emmett said. "He always did like the dark," Millicent said from the doorway, wrapped in one of Emmett's spare coats. "Said old folks got confused after nightfall. Said nobody would believe us if we hollered." Barnaby's jaw tightened, old shame crossing his face again. "I should have stopped him years ago." Emmett looked at the old man for a long moment. "You're stopping him now." It didn't heal anything, but Barnaby's grip on the cane steadied all the same, and out past the fence line, where the dark pooled thickest near the tree line, Sarge stood motionless, ears forward, already listening to something none of the humans could hear yet. Near midnight, Sarge's ears came up first. Emmett saw it before he heard anything. The dog's head swinging toward the back pasture, body lowering, breath going quiet and deliberate. Then, faint under the wind, metal, shifting against wire. Emmett killed the kitchen lamp. 3 shapes slipped through a freshly cut gap in the fence, one broad and familiar, the other 2 moving like men paid to forget what they'd seen. Roderick had brought help. Otto Kraus, a thick-necked miner with a coal oil can, and Fenwick Doyle, younger, twitchy, clutching a box of matches like it might save him. "Back room, both of you bar the door," Emmett told Barnaby and Millicent. Sarge watched them go, then looked to Emmett for the only order that mattered. "Stay close." They moved out the side door, low and quiet, the wet ground pulling at Emmett's boots. At the barn, Roderick's voice cut through the dark. "Near the back wall. Make it look like bad wiring." "Bad plan," Emmett said, stepping from the shadows. All 3 froze. Roderick's surprise curdled fast into rage. "Should have minded your own farm." "You brought this to it," Emmett said. Otto hurled the coal oil can toward the hay. It struck the boards and spilled a dark line across the straw. Fenwick fumbled a match. Sarge moved before the flame caught, barking with a force that sent Fenwick stumbling backward, the match dying in the mud. Emmett closed the distance, turned aside Otto's clumsy swing, and put him on one knee without breaking anything but his confidence. Roderick bolted for the farmhouse, shouting for his grandfather, and found Barnaby already on the porch, cane in hand, refusing to hide. "You stupid old man," Roderick snarled. "Do you understand what you've cost me?" "We buried your mother and raised you anyway," Barnaby said, voice shaking but whole. "And you turned around and robbed us blind." Sarge hit the porch steps like a shadow given teeth, placing himself squarely between them just as lantern light and shouting rolled up the lane. Sheriff Ackley, Deputy Bramwell, and young Thaddeus Renner, riding in fast, far too late to stop the fire, and exactly in time for everything else. Judge Reinhold Bergstrom heard the case 3 weeks later in a courtroom that still smelled faintly of limestone dust. He reviewed the forged deed, Dr. Tillman's findings, the locked room, the mining letter, and Prudence Ackerman's notes, and restored the Attwater land before lunch recess. Roderick was convicted of elder abuse, forgery, and attempted arson, sentenced to enough years that even his lawyer stopped arguing details. The Galena Ridge Mining Company withdrew its offer within the week. Men who build fortunes on fear rarely stick around once the fear runs out. Barnaby and Millicent didn't move back to the old house right away. Millicent said the rooms needed sunlight first. Barnaby said the porch needed mending. Emmett understood the truth was heavier than either excuse. A deed could be restored in an afternoon, but trust took longer to rebuild than any fence. So they stayed. Spring came slow and stubborn over the ridge, the way it always does in Wisconsin, and Millicent planted marigolds along Emmett's porch steps while Barnaby taught him a knot his own father had used before wire clips existed. Sarge appointed himself supervisor of both projects and stole 1 biscuit for every hour of honest labor performed by anyone within reach of his nose. "Your dog is a criminal," Millicent told Emmett one evening, not for the first time. "Only in pastry-related matters," Emmett said. Word got around, the way it does in small towns built on old mining gossip. A widowed neighbor came asking about her own son and the bank papers he'd started handling for her. A retired school teacher asked if 2 elderly friends from her church could just sit on the porch a while and talk to somebody who'd listen. Emmett never called it anything official. Names made things sound permanent, and permanence had never much interested him. But people came anyway, with pie tins and old fears and papers they didn't understand, and somehow there was always coffee, always a chair, and always a big brindle dog willing to rest his head wherever the grief sat heaviest. If this story moved you, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and who you'd open your door for.